time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome to another podcast by George, rolling through 2020, hoping that the new year will be better, hoping each and every day will improve. So far, I'm not seeing much of it, folks. We've got our good friend, our medical guest, back on the podcast by George live line today, Dr. Andrew Nish. And I also wanted to, again, thank the people that help out with the show by making a lot of it possible with the opens and the music. You hear Ron Placone opening, Bob Pace, Desharm Jones, Matt Woods. They're great music. And that announcer voice that I use, John Schaefer, he's on there. And sometimes I don't know if it's going to be music or announcing. I don't know which show open we're going to have. So it's kind of potluck. But I'm really grateful to those folks for helping me do the podcast. And it reminds me, this particular podcast is going to be 196. The episode of Podcast by George. I started these a little over 2 years ago in retirement, and I retired early, and I'm glad that I did. I tell everybody, I was working in the marketing world. I had an opportunity maybe to check out real early in 2008, and the powers that be, all the way from the oligarchs, as they call them, to the politicians, to the banking segment of the economy, blew it up, and I wasn't able to do that. And so I put my nose to the grindstone and went back to work. And as soon as I got my earliest opportunity at age 62 to check out here 3 years ago, I did. And the first 2 years were great. I mean, honest to God, man, I was living large. I was playing a lot of hockey, working on my game, actually improving somewhat. At least I thought I was, based on all the ice time that I was getting. And of course, I was moving around, checking out these bands that I like, and was really a pleasant surprise to see how good the local music scene was. Bob Pace and Desharm Jones, Matt Woods, all of those great bands that are here locally. Was really enjoying that, and kind of had my routine down, kind of had things going along. That, man, this is a pretty good retirement. And of course, the podcasts were a big part of that too. Kablooey blows up on me again. So here I am. I'm still doing the podcast, and by God, I'm glad that I am, because they take time. It's something that I'm somewhat adept at, that I can do a fairly decent job at, and it's a great hobby while I'm waiting for things to open up and for life to get back to some degree of normalcy, and I hope it will. And we talk about the good doctor about that once in a while, and his advice, I know, is go with what you got, live in the moment, be happy, and thrive and survive. So, Doc, that's kind of a long-winded open, but it's always good to see you. Welcome back to a podcast by George.
Thanks, George.
Good
to be here.
I read this bio for folks, and it kind of jumped out right before this episode, particularly. It says that you serve as the John Stoddard Cancer Center medical director, but it also says, as medical director, Dr. Nish serves as an important link to the medical staff and works to facilitate discussions around quality clinical trials and patient care enhancement. So, clinical trials have been a big part of your life for a number of years. Like I say, it's often discussed in your community. We've got some extremely, maybe the most important clinical trials underway, I don't know, since the polio vaccine or the AIDS epidemic or whatever right now with COVID-19. It looks like, what I'm seeing and hearing, that they're getting closer faster to finding a vaccine than they thought they were, and they're jumping into these trials. Can you kind of, what's a vaccine trial going to look like? What is that exactly?
Yeah, so, trials are complex. Living in the world of cancer, we're always doing clinical trials. And so one of the things people see is phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, right? And I just kind of want to explain in very simple terms what that means. So a phase 1 trial means we are testing a drug or vaccine, but it's very early. So a phase 1 trial is really looking, is it safe? Okay, is it safe to give to humans? So we're really looking at toxicities of that drug or vaccine. And it's really a very clinical controlled trial, meaning there's very few people, maybe less than 100 typically, maybe a couple hundred. It's very, very clinical in that we're monitoring everything about those patients. It's not randomized, so people aren't getting a placebo or a fake drug or injection. They're getting the real thing. And what we're really looking for is it safe? Are there toxicities that are going to prohibit it from moving on to phase 2? So, vaccine trials right now, there's dozens of them going on in the world. Many of them are in phase 1 or phase 2. In this country, we have three phase 3 trials right now. So phase 2 means, okay, we've determined that that drug or vaccine is safe. Now we want to test it on a larger group of people and look for efficacy. So meaning, does it elicit antibodies to the virus? Does it elicit T cell changes? So these T cells are part of our immune system that can recognize foreign invaders. And does it work? So does it keep people from getting the disease from which we're trying to protect them? So typically for phase 2 trials, we're going to do hundreds to several thousand people. Again, we're going to be looking very closely at toxicities and adverse events. Once we get done with phase 2, then we move to phase 3. And that's where we're giving the vaccine to thousands and thousands of people. And we're doing it in what's called a randomized fashion. So it's a double-blind, randomized controlled trial, meaning half the people will get the vaccine, half the people won't. The people administering the vaccine won't know who's getting what. Only the computer picks whether the person's getting the vaccine or not. So a person cannot pick and say, well, I want the vaccine or I want the placebo. That's picked for you. And so what the phase 3 trial is trying to do is to see is that vaccine protecting people against the disease. And so we compare the number of people who get the disease who got the vaccine versus the number of people who got the disease with the placebo and see how effective it is. And those trials sometimes are overlapped with phase 2. Sometimes phase 2 and phase 1 are overlapped, particularly when we're trying to do this quickly. But there's only, it can only be done so quickly. You can't just speed this up infinitely, and it will take months. Most people know the Astrazeneca trial was stopped a couple weeks ago. There was an adverse event in England. It was an event called transverse myelitis, where our immune system causes havoc in our nervous system. The trial has opened back up in Britain, but it is not opened back up in South Africa, India, or the United States. So that trial is still on partial hold. There are 2 other phase 3 trials going on right now. Moderna has a phase 3 trial and Pfizer has a phase 3 trial in this country. A 4th phase 3 trial will begin later this month or October. J&J will be in charge of that trial. So we are making progress at potentially having a viable vaccine. But you know what? There's going to probably be multiple candidates for vaccines. So each one of these is approaching it a little bit differently as how they're developing that vaccine. And we probably will have multiple different vaccines, I would guess, in the future. We will probably learn that certain vaccines are better for a certain population than others. This is what we anticipate. We don't know. There's a really great saying, and this really pertains to COVID-19. It really is, life, we always want to be in the know, but we should really live in the mystery. And, when we live in the mystery, everything becomes much more interesting because an expert has this very narrow view. Whereas if you're a little kid and you don't know much, you can really look at things in a much different way. And I think a lot of these vaccine trials have approached it that way. We're doing some novel things we've never done before with vaccines. So most vaccines before were either a killed virus or meaning the virus, it's a viral particle, but it's killed, and we inject that to stimulate an immune response. We've used what's called live attenuated virus, where we take the virus, we attenuate it so it does not become pathologic, but it evokes immune responses. But now we're looking at making protein viruses. We're looking at making viruses based on short nucleic acid RNA sequences. Those have never been made before in non-replicating fashion. So we're doing things that haven't been done before. So we're really pushing the frontier of vaccines. So will we have a viable vaccine in the next few months? Maybe. But here's what we don't know, and here's what people miss. It's one thing to have a vaccine come out of a laboratory, but it's another thing to actually get it into people's arms. So there's this whole other process of manufacturing the vaccine and this whole chain of processes that have to happen in order to get it into your arm. And that's where we are probably not equipped to make these doses. So, right now you talked about, is it a 1-dose, is it a 2-dose vaccine? We think it's probably going to be a 2-dose vaccine. It could be a 1-dose, but I think most of them that are in trials right now are going to be 2-dose vaccines. So that means if you want to vaccinate everybody in this country, you have to have 660 million doses of vaccine. That's a lot of vaccine. There's a fascinating article that was written earlier in September by a guy by the name of Emmanuel Ezekiel out of University of Pennsylvania. And he went through sort of the supply chain and what we have to do to get this vaccine in people's arms. And there were 22 steps in it, the least of which was actually making the vaccine. So one of the steps is called the final fill step, where we put the vaccine in these little vials, and that requires an incredibly sterile environment. That could be the rate limiting step. We don't have enough of those environments. Another thing that could be rate limiting is the number of glass vials that we have. So the glass we use for vaccines is very different than just plain glass. It has to be coated with some special chemicals to stabilize the vaccine and things. Well, there's only one company in the United States that makes it. That's Corning. There's a German company that makes this glass and an Italian company, but they're not up to speed to make hundreds of millions of glass vials. And you have to remember, they're also making glass vials for all the other vaccinations. So we have to more than double our capacity to make glass vials. Syringes, needles, we have to generate more capacity for that. So there's this incredible supply chain that has to take place even after a vaccine's developed in order to get this to the public. Now, depending on what vaccine is going to be the quote vaccine, then there's issues of storage. So some of these RNA vaccines have to be stored in extremely cold environments with carbon dioxide, ice, dry ice. Well, now we have to equip clinics with these storage devices. And so it's an incredibly ambitious undertaking to get this vaccine from the laboratory into the arms of people. And I mean, frankly, our government is not doing a good job at supporting this supply chain. We're not building potential plants. I mean, if you want to build one of these sterile facilities for final fill, it's a 3 to 5 year project.
Wow.
And we haven't even thought about it, really. I mean, I think the intellectuals have thought about it, but the government has no plan. They're just kind of willy-nilly throwing money at stuff. So there's a lot of hype about the vaccine, but getting the vaccine into everybody's arm, months, if not years away.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about people taking the vaccine. Obviously, to stop the spread, have some rate of, not cure, but vaccination, you got to have a lot of people do it. Some people are not wanting to take it. Some people believe the government's going to insert a microchip with their vaccine and control their minds. I mean, you got that group of people out there. I'm not like that, but I do have some concern about the speed at which this is being developed, and I liken it to an airplane pilot maybe going through a checklist up there in the cockpit while I'm sitting back in the passenger compartment. I don't want that guy to be rushed. I want him to take time with that checklist and do it normally like he always does. I don't care if there's a storm coming in. I don't want him skipping any steps because the result can be disastrous. When you look at the speed at which we're moving with the development of this vaccine, Does that concern you at all, or is there any rule of thumb when it comes to just the speed? Can it be as quickly as it needs to be?
Yeah, you know what? The speed that the laboratories are working on this doesn't bother me. It's really about making sure that the approval process is not disrupted or shortened. That, you know what? Let's go ahead. We can make these vaccines. Some of them can be made quite quickly. We need to do the appropriate clinical trials with the appropriate number of people. We have to have the appropriate data of adverse events, because you got to remember, most of these trials are going to test anywhere from 30,000 to 60,000 people. Now, once we start giving that vaccine, we're going to be giving it to millions and millions of people. So what we're really looking for in those 30 to 60,000 are there common adverse events that are happening? But here's the most important thing. As we give vaccines to more and more people, it's the responsibility of the government and the drug companies who are manufacturing these vaccines to keep tabs on these much more rare adverse events, because we will see those, okay? We will see events that we didn't see in that 30 to 60,000 people. And so it's called post-marketing surveillance. We want to make sure that we're really surveying and making sure we're capturing these very rare adverse events to know what's going on. So I don't have a problem with the speed with which we're developing, but boy, oh boy, the FDA, and it's been emphasized by many experts, has to be absolutely transparent about what they're doing and cannot succumb to political pressure. Because if there's any hint of succumbing to political pressure to get these vaccines out quickly, the amount of distrust of the general public is going to skyrocket. And it already is, because there's just so much false information out there. So the FDA cannot screw this up. They have to be absolutely precise in their evaluation. They cannot skip a step. Like you said, you can't skip a step in your checklist, and they have to be absolutely transparent with the general public. If there's any hint of impropriety, if there's any hint of secrecy, it's going to be a disaster, because people will say, screw it. The government is not giving me true information. And that's a huge problem we have right now. With our politicians saying one thing and putting pressure on the CDC. I don't know if you read the paper this morning. So there's been something that the CDC puts out they've done it for decades, called the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. Well, it's been revealed that report has been scrutinized and in some cases changed by politicians at the Housing and Human HHS. So we're losing credibility, and our current administration is probably the most inept administration you could imagine dealing with this situation.
No argument for me. You know where I stand on that. And the point of it is, and I tell people all the time, when it comes time for the vaccination, when it comes time for the next steps in this thing, don't get it from a podcaster. Don't get it from a politician. There's some people that are saying we're going to have a vaccine in 3 weeks. You just said it's such an unknown. It could be 3 to 5 years based on some of these other variables.
Well,
it's somewhere in between, but yeah.
It won't be 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
We may have a vaccination, but what do you label as a vaccination? The vaccine coming out of the lab, or the vaccine available for mass distribution? They're two very different things. Yeah, we may have a vaccine coming out of the lab by the end of the year, but when are we going to be able to ramp up the capability to administer that to tens of millions of people? So they're very different. And I think that, looking at supply chains, from what I've read by Dr. Ezekiel, looking at, what it takes to get that vaccine, we may start vaccinating people early next year, but we will not have the general population vaccinated in 6 months or anything like that. So I think, we have to set expectations for the general public. The expectation people want to hear is, we'll have a vaccine, life will be back to normal next spring. I think that we should set the expectation very differently. I think we should set the expectation that, we are going to be dealing with this virus just like we are now for at least another 9 to 12 months. So if we set that expectation up that, you know what, I'm going to have to, run my life as it is now, then if the vaccine comes earlier and we get better mass distribution than we thought, that's a win, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, great. Now I can go back to what I wanted to do. But if we set the expectation up that that vaccine is going to be available in April and it's not available till next September, then we've only set ourselves up for disappointment. So let's set ourselves up for having something good happen as opposed to setting ourselves up for something that may not be so good for our lives. It's all about how you set yourself up in life, man.
That's exactly right, man. That's well said. That's why I love to have him on the show, folks. I mean, it's Dr. Andrew Nish. He could talk about everything from Far Eastern religion to quantum physics to vaccines to cancer treatments. I mean, okay, Doc, and we're running out of time again. I want to give you the last word here. Anything else that's top of mind that you want to share with folks? And it's open to whatever you want to talk about.
Oh, you know what? I go back to this every time, and I just, life is an uncertain proposition, and we have to live with the uncertainty, and we have to be comfortable with the uncertainty. I just can't say that enough because, what causes stress? Stress is when we want something to be that isn't, right?
Yeah.
So take time to just enjoy what life is right now. Take time to enjoy your family. Take time to really introspectively give thanks for what you have in this life. And don't try and worry about what isn't. Yeah, what isn't is we can't just do anything we want. But we have so many freedoms and we have so much ability to be happy. And I want people to understand that happiness comes from within. It doesn't come from the mall. It doesn't come from external forces. It comes from within. And so look at yourself and understand what you can do for your life to be content and happy. It's all about you. It's all about your ability to do that.
That's great. I appreciate it. Thanks again, Doc. Thanks for coming on a podcast by George. We'll circle back here very soon, but I really appreciate this visit.
Well, thank you. And, I don't want to be a naysayer on vaccines. We will probably have a vaccine, but to think we're going to mass distribute it in 3 months is not going to happen.
All right.
Thank you.
I trust you, that's for sure. That's Dr. Andrew Nish, folks. He's the John Stoddard Cancer Center Medical Director. He's a frequent guest on Podcast by George. He's just a smart guy. That's why I like to have him on. And I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you like the podcast. And if you do, get the audio versions on iTunes. That's a great place to get it on your iPhone. On iTunes, but watch us on YouTube and also on Facebook. Check out the video versions because a lot of time and effort goes into producing those also. And again, thanks for all those folks that contribute their music and announcements and all that type of thing to help make this possible. That's going to do it for right now, though. That's going to wrap it up. We'll be back with you again very soon. That's another podcast by George.